Hello, everyone. My name is Hussam El Sherbini. I teach Arabic language and culture at the Center for Languages and Intercultural Communication. My talk today will focus on second language instruction in dual delivery mode. To be clear, I will not talk about remote teaching or the ins and outs of using Zoom, but rather I will focus on my successes and failures during this past fall 2020, in which I taught three different levels of Arabic language. I hope you will find some of the things that I will say to be useful. My main points today will be as follows. I will start with challenges that I personally encountered when I started teaching in dual delivery mode. And then I will give an overview of the classroom setup with specific reference to the classroom to the actual classroom where I taught. The bulk of my presentation today will focus on tips and suggestions, and then these will be followed by an example of a class activity. And finally, I will conclude with a few general recommendations. Before going any further, I want to take a minute to touch upon the definition of dual delivery. And some of you might have heard the term dual delivery, but also other equivalent terms that have been floating around, some of which are flexible hybrid or high flex or Zoom flex. And all of these different delivery modalities are more or less the same. In fact, these terms are used interchangeably because they all imply a modality of delivery that is hybrid because it allows students to attend in person in classroom or remotely if they choose to. And you can even add another layer if you allow students to attend class remotely and asynchronously. And at the same time, all of these delivery modalities are flexible because students are able to choose their preferred method of attendance depending on their excuse me, depending on their own individual circumstances. And the change in the course delivery mode, of course, has radical implications for class activities, particularly for language classes that are generally interactive, student-centered, and collaborative. I personally encountered two sets of challenges when I started teaching in dual delivery. The first one is inherent to Zoom. These are Zoom specific challenges, and I'm talking specifically about the latency, the fact that students have to unmute before speaking, um, and what I generally like referring to as digital awkwardness. Zoom doesn't have the natural and smooth flow of in-person teaching. It's kind of hard to jump into the conversation because of the latency and the unmuting. And the second set of challenges has to do with the dual delivery. And these challenges are prompted by the nature of dual delivery, where you have two somewhat separate cohorts of students. This challenge is, of course, compounded by the fact that students switch often between cohorts, at least during the first few weeks of instruction, until they find their preferred method of attendance. And of course, while students are generally appreciative of the flexibility that we allow them in determining their preferred method of attendance, flexibility for them usually means unpredictability for us. And it can be quite challenging to optimize your lesson plan if you don't know for sure how many students you're going to have in person, how many students you're going to have on Zoom. But I think that the overarching question here is how can learners achieve the same objectives through different learning media? That is, how can you create an equitable learning experience and a class that is inclusive to everyone? So for me, the key word here is equity. Um, and delivering an equitable learning experience. It's often the case that our focus is naturally drawn towards the in-person students, while remote students feel like they are an afterthought and they can easily fade into the background. And just to be clear, by equitable learning experience, I do not mean providing all students with the same exact learning experience, but personalizing the learning experience so that it fits the individual student and their own needs based on their method of attendance. The other issue is class homogeneity. Interactions in a language classroom are often multi-directional, but also almost always circular in the sense that they are cohort specific. And so you have these two circles of interaction that usually do not intersect. It feels like we are running two different classes simultaneously. You are talking to your in-person students, you're giving them a specific set of instructions that works for them, and then you're turning to your Zoom students and you're giving them another set of instructions so that they can carry out the same activity. And so this really limits peer teaching opportunities and it takes away from the collaborative and interactive aspect of the class. Other issues that I have personally struggled with have to do with creating a sense of classroom community, which you can easily do if you're teaching entirely in person. And of course, there are ways in which you can do it if you're teaching 100% remotely. But when you're teaching a hybrid class, that can be more challenging. And finally, technology failures. I think despite the best efforts of the Office of Information Technology, there are technology failures that happen unexpectedly. And I personally at least had two incidents this past semester in which none of the technology in the classroom worked. And so I had to improvise and have a contingency plan. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, I wanted to share with you this um, student hierarchy of needs, which is based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs for learners. And if you take a look at the um, base of the pyramid, you see that students need to hear the instructor. This is the most basic and primary need that they have, which I would argue is more important than seeing the instructor. That is followed by the ability to see the class materials and notes, especially if you're teaching, like me, a second language class, and you are perhaps writing on the board a number of new vocabulary items. And so students need to take a look at the spelling of these items. This is followed by the student's ability to see the instructor and their peers, and then to be heard by the instructor, which is very important, especially if students need to ask questions or clarifications. And then students also need to hear their peers and they need to be able to interact with their peers. And once all of these things happen naturally, they lead to the last part that you see here at the top of the pyramid, which is participation in the discussion. And so the participation in the discussion here is intended as sort of an organic spontaneous participation where students are able to unmute themselves and talk um, and participate in the conversation or in the discussion right away. And so there are two sorts of channels that are important here to keep in mind. The first one is the auditory channel, and the second one is the visual channel. And when both of these channels align correctly, you can have the spontaneous participation in class activities that we all hope for. Before moving forward, I wanted to give a quick overview of the classroom setup with specific reference to the classroom where I taught. I taught in Razor Hall 205, which is a wonderful classroom. This is a recently renovated classroom that has three LCD screens that you can see here. The first one is at the on the far end wall of the classroom, and then there's another screen on the left wall, and there's a third screen behind the instructor. There are four cameras. First one is above the first screen, the second one is next to the second screen, the third one is again behind the instructor, and there's a fourth one that is um, on the actual podium, um, the actual teaching podium, and it's attached to the monitor. There is a ceiling microphone that is um, is located in the central part of the ceiling. So this is the classroom setup. One of the reason why I wanted to share this with you is because one of the first things I realized once I started teaching the first few classes in dual delivery mode is that I need to secure a direct visual and auditory channel between my in-person students and my Zoom students. And so I quickly realized that I also needed to change the seating configuration. Where do I sit? I need to allow for direct visual contact between students and visual contact between myself and my students. The classroom is wonderful, but it has one too many screens. And so students don't necessarily know where to sit. Once they step into the classroom, their first instinct is to face the instructor. And so you want them to face you, but you also want them to be able to see their peers and be seen by their peers. And so I asked my students to sit in a semicircular configuration, facing the one LCD screen that is located at the far end of the classroom, um, and to look at the camera, which happens to be right above that screen. I also needed to check the view of my remote students often, which I could do by simply looking at the LCD screen located right below the camera. And if you take a quick look, you can see there is a small window where you can see yourself, the in-person students. And if you take the vertical bar and slide it towards the left, that is highlighted here on the picture, you can also see all of your Zoom students, which was very important for me because I needed to see all of them. Now, you will also need to make sure that in addition to seeing all of your students, you need to perform a sound check and make sure that you project from the diaphragm. And this is an instruction that I also gave to all of my students, especially because my in-person students are wearing a mask, so their voices are muffled. And in addition to that, Zoom students don't necessarily know which student is talking because of the mask. And so I asked my in-person students to make themselves seen when they speak. They can do so by doing a gesture, by gesticulating with their hands or raising their hand before speaking so that they can identify themselves and make themselves seen. You will need to coordinate with your tech TA. This is something that I also had to realize early on. I coordinated with my tech TA and clarified their duties and responsibilities. And I told them that they will be taking on the role of the director in a film, kind of. And so this also means that they have to use the zoom in and out capabilities of the camera to follow the person who is talking. If I were to get up and write something on the board or move around the classroom, they need to be able to follow me with the camera or other or students who might be getting up and talking. Go paperless if possible. And then I haven't had the luxury of doing that 100% during this past semester because I had a few students who preferred to get um, their course materials in paper format. So I printed the materials for those students, but then for all other students who did not have an issue going paperless, we went paperless, which is great because it saves you a lot of time and you have everything you need on Google Drive, which is where we kept all of our class materials organized in subfolders, in weekly subfolders. But also it's environmentally responsible, so it's a win-win for everybody. I used my iPad for note taking, which really made it easy for me to log in on the same account to the same Zoom meeting on my iPad as a second device and take notes, share my screen on the iPad and take notes so that everybody, including my in-person students, can see the notes that I'm taking. And so the shared screen also appears on the LCD screen in the classroom. Finally, have a backup plan. And so my backup plan was to um, bring my personal computer to class every time I had to teach. Just in case of a technology failure, I could just pull out my computer and use it to see and be seen by my Zoom students. In terms of pedagogy related tips, I found it very useful to flip the classroom so that students prepare the material at home ahead of time, and class time is devoted to activities that build upon what students already prepared at home. This really saves precious synchronous time that you can use for collaborative learning. Boost your feedback to remote students. A big part of providing an equitable learning experience is compensating for the lack of immediate feedback to your remote students by checking in with them more often and diversifying the feedback that you give them so that it's not always written feedback by email. Remember that meaningful feedback is personal. It's task specific and positive, but also timely. So you don't want to wait too long after a class activity to give them feedback. And instead of giving them feedback by email, you might want to consider using Canvas audio and video comments feature to give feedback. Um, One thing that I did this past semester was reserving one of my office hours every week for my remote students. I reached out to them and I told them that this was specifically for them if they wanted to come grab a virtual coffee with me. Streamline your lesson plan and consider consolidating your activities so that you're not hopping between one activity and the other within a relatively short period of time. My class session is 55 minutes, and between grappling with technology and giving instructions to students, you really don't want to have too many activities to be covering during the session. So in the past, I used to um, want to include a lot of things in my lesson plan, and that usually resulted in uh, hopping between activities, which can happen, of course, if all of your students are attending in person. It can be a natural transition and a quick transition between one activity and the other. When pre-planning the activities, you will want to determine which ones allow both audiences to work collaboratively and favor those. And you also need to remember that collaborative work can be confined to a certain part of your lesson plan. It doesn't need to be your main focus for the duration of the entire session. Finally, assign roles for various activities. And if you're like me and you give um, instructions in your target language, it can take um, extra time because you need to speak in a specific way, you need to be using certain vocabulary, and you would probably have to repeat yourself at least once. And so assigning roles, preferably ahead of time, is a great way to save time so that students know which one is in charge of writing, if it's a writing activity, which one is in charge of relaying the discussion or like reading the discussion prompts or relaying the opinion that the group of students has agreed on, and so on and so forth. This is an example of a class activity that I did with my Arabic language students at the advanced level. And the overarching theme of the class was income inequality in Egypt. This is primarily a writing activity that includes a reading and speaking components. There are primary and secondary language goals, which include past tense narration, using connectors to link sentences together, and formulating hypotheses. And there's, of course, a the soft skills that we are targeting here are critical thinking and collaborative work. The activity is based on a short film, and I'm going to give you a quick synopsis of the film. Um, the film starts, this is an 8-minute short film that starts with a down and out boy who is loitering at a train station and wearing a broken and irreparable slipper. The boy at some point looks around and happens to see a rich boy nearby wearing glistening black shoes. So, as the rich boy boards the train, he loses one of his shoes, and the train departs without the rich boy being able to retrieve the shoe. And so the poor boy rushes towards the shiny shoe and picks it up. And these are the first 4 minutes of the film, which is all students will see during the first part of the activity, as I will explain in a minute. This is how the activity is structured. Students at home study a short vocabulary list that they use to write a paragraph to describe a screenshot from the movie. And the question that they are asked is, what do you see in this screenshot, and what do you think the story of this short movie is? And so at this point, they haven't seen the movie yet. They don't see it until we're in class all together. Students are also given the title of the movie and they're asked to speculate about the story. And in class, we have these main 4 steps. So in class, we watch the first 4 minutes, and then we go over the writing prompts, which are given in this worksheet. And if you take a look at the worksheet, you will see that uh, students are already divided into 2 groups. I had 9 students in this class, and so I divided them into one group of 5 and another group of 4 students. And for each group, I specified the person who will be in charge of writing, which they have to do on a Google Doc that is shared with the entire class. So everybody's working on the same Google Doc, whether they are working in person or on Zoom, and the person whose name is followed by an asterisk is going to be in charge of writing. But this is, of course, a collaborative activity, so everybody jumps in and contributes. So we go over the writing prompts in class, and students are told that they have the liberty of making up their own story as long as it is grounded in the film. The second step of the activity, we go to breakout rooms, and students are divided into two groups. As I said, they are asked to write one paragraph on Google Doc to describe what they just watched. Um, and the groups are created in a way so that all remote students work together and all in-person students work together. Roles are assigned beforehand and feedback is given in two ways. I watch the shared document and on the main computer at the podium, and I highlight in yellow the parts that need attention or that need to be revised so that the students can make any necessary corrections. Then I follow up after class on a few language points in an audio file to my remote students only. Of course, when it comes to my in-person students, they are also using one device that they are using to write their paragraph, but I'm giving them immediate feedback. Then we come back to class, to the main session, and students switch paragraphs so that each group reads the other group's paragraph and asks questions about their story. And then we watch the second chunk of 4 minutes of the film and repeat the activity again. So students again watch, they read the writing prompts, they go to their breakout room, and they work with their team on writing a second paragraph. And so finally, uh, of course, during the second activity where students write a second paragraph, they build on the other team's story so that group one continues the story of group two and vice versa. And then we come back to the class, and this is the last um, step of the activity where we read and discuss the ending as a whole class with in-person students reading their story and answering questions from the Zoom students and vice versa. The goal is, of course, to facilitate a natural interaction between my in-person and Zoom students without forcing it in every step of the way. A couple of general recommendations. The first one is to uh, have students fill out a technology readiness survey ahead of time and use it as an opportunity to clarify the tech requirements for remote students. Now, this is how my technology preparedness survey looked like. And I sent it ahead of time, about a week or 10 days prior to the beginning of the semester. My goal here was not to tell students what kind of technology they needed, but rather collect feedback so that I know exactly how many of my students have a personal laptop they can use, so that I have realistic expectations as to whether my students can bring their own personal device to class or if I needed to come up with an alternative solution. The second recommendation is to check in regularly with the students and collect their feedback. Make sure you diversify the feedback that you give to them. I found it very useful to check in with them at least once every 2 weeks to see how we're doing. Of course, it's always our hope that students are going to be forthcoming and clear whenever they encounter an issue, but that's not always the case. So it's good to check in and make sure that students are on track and they're doing what they're supposed to do and they're not encountering any difficulties. And this slides concludes my presentation. Thank you.